Hello, fellow birders. My name is Dennis Kania. Today we're going to be taking a closer look at the return of ospreys to DuPage County. On the DuPage Birding Club Education channel, we'll be discussing all things bird related. And as I mentioned, today we'll be talking about the return of ospreys to DuPage County. It's quite a remarkable story that we have these birds back in our presence. So here are a couple of range maps. One of them is from a Peterson field guide from 1980. And you can see that the breeding range for ospreys at that time was in northern Wisconsin as the southern edge, and also halfway through Michigan. And that's the closest that we had birds breeding to us here in DuPage County. If we take a look at this larger map, which reflects what is currently going on, you can see that there's been considerable expansion. And so now the birds in Wisconsin are coming all the way down to the border. And in fact, we have a small area here in northeastern Illinois that also shows them breeding. And you can see they're all the way down to the bottom of Michigan as well. And that expansion has taken place everywhere throughout their earlier range. You can see that birds that were resident in Florida, on this map here, you can see that that has expanded all the way up into Georgia, into South Carolina. They're over here in Alabama. So there's been quite an expansion. The New England area as well has seen some recovery. And what's amazing about this bird is that a little over 60 years ago, there weren't any ospreys breeding in our area. And everybody knows the story about the bald eagle and the impact of DDT on those birds. Well, the same thing was happening to the osprey as well. They're also on the top of the food chain. And so as the DDT accumulated, as it made its way up that pyramid, the concentration levels had a serious effect on bald eagles and ospreys as well. And that led to a thinning of the eggshells of the birds, which led to many more failed nesting attempts. So here it is over 60 years later since the recovery started, and we now have ospreys returning to DuPage County. So our data at Fermilab that we've been collecting for the last 33 years reflects that change. You can see in the early survey periods that we had birds, in the spring migration showing up. We had them in the fall migration showing up. And it wasn't until the 2007 to 2011 survey period, which is this green bar, that's when all of a sudden we started having birds breeding at Fermilab, and actually within the county just prior to that. So since then, you can see each survey period, each 5-year survey period is reflecting the fact that we do have ospreys here through the entire breeding season. So the first nest that was identified in the county was in an area up by James Pate Phillips State Park, which is in the far northwest corner of the county. And I don't have an exact date for when that first nest appeared, but it was in the very early 2000s. And that did mark the return of them nesting as a nesting species. And they, as I said, they had been absent for more than 60 years. So this pair actually utilized several nest sites up in that area, and they moved around, and they were, as far as I know, successful in fledging young every year. I'm not sure that that nest is still active, but that certainly marked the introduction or re-entry of the birds into DuPage County. So where we've had a lot of success is at Fermilab, and we've had several nesting pairs now utilizing the site. And the first ones showed up in 2009, and that was at this nest site right here. The second nest was claimed in 2012. So earlier in the year in 2012, a nesting platform was erected on a pond in this part of Fermilab right here. And we were very interested to see if those birds would return the following spring and actually attempt to nest, and they did. However, they did not do so with success, but we'll get into that more in a little bit. The third nesting pair arrived in 2015, and they chose a site relatively close to our first nesting pair. And initially, they actually nested here where my cursor is. And where they currently reside is right here, and I'll explain that in a minute as well. And just so you can get some bearings on where you are, since Fermilab is a very large place, this is Batavia Road. So if you're coming into Fermilab from the east, you'd be coming in on Batavia Road, and this is where the gate would be, right at this location here. If you're coming in from the west, you'd be coming in off of Kirk Road, and you'd be entering on Pine Street. So here's that road. And there is a gate station right here. Here's where the Leon Letterman Education Center is. And here's Wilson Hall, the Fermilab high-rise. So that should give you some bearings on where all of these nests are located. And I'll point out that all of these nests are in restricted areas. So all of them are inaccessible. You should not be trying to visit them. This one here on the east side can actually be viewed from Batavia Road, because you've got the whole length of this pond here, and that's nesting platform is on a pole that is very, very tall. So you can actually see this nest from that road by using a spotting scope. These others are pretty much off limits, and it'd be impossible to actually get close enough to see those nests. So here's a little closer look at what was going on with nest number 3. As I mentioned, they initially started out right here, and that's in relatively close proximity to nest number 1, which is here. So when they arrived here, it was late in the breeding season. They did make an attempt to nest here and were unsuccessful. And unfortunately, this site that they chose is in the footprint of a large construction project that was going to be taking place at Fermilab in the research of particle physics. So there was no way that this nest was going to be able to stay where it was. So during the winter, the nest was actually removed, and it was moved to a new pole that is stationed here. And a platform box was utilized exactly like the one that was on nest number 2 on the east end of the site. And so the material from this nest was then put on that platform, and we waited till spring to see what was going to happen. And sure enough, when the birds returned, it looked like they were going to accept this nest site. They started perching here, and then looked like they were going to take over and resume, building that nest. But then after a short time, they kept going back to this pole, which had not been removed. The crossbars on the pole had been removed, and so it was impossible for them to actually make a nest here, but they kept returning to this pole, wanting very much to nest here. And eventually they realized that they couldn't, and for some reason then they moved to another pole far away over in this section here, and this is where they now reside. So that first year was a very, very rough year for them, since they got a late start, and it was 2 years in a row then with a late start, so they were unsuccessful again. So let's go back and visit all 3 of the nests. This is nest number 1. This is what the structure actually looks like. This is on a power line that is actually a dead line, so we don't have to worry about a juice going through any of these lines at all. And again, this appeared in 2009. And that year, one chick was fledged. And this nest has remained active since 2009. And there were actually 2 years where they produced 4 offspring in 1 year. That happened in 2014 as well as 2017. So over the past 11 years that this nest has been active, they've actually produced 28 offspring. So that's pretty remarkable. Nest number 2, which is that one on the east side, and that structure was again placed in a pond in the early part of 2012. And it wasn't until the fall of 2012 that 2 ospreys discovered it, and they started actually building or adding nesting material to the platform. When they returned in the spring of 2013, they continued to build on that nest, but they were unsuccessful in raising any young. They returned again in 2014 and once again were unsuccessful. So it wasn't until 2015 and 2016 that they started producing offspring. And so they were now contributing to the overall number that we're getting out of Fermilab. In 2017, there was a nest failure, and we weren't exactly sure what had happened there. Fairly early in the nesting season, that failure occurred, and the birds just left the nest. They abandoned it. They did return in 2018, and they were nesting there. And there was another failure, but this was later in the year. There were already chicks, and some unknown predator came in and raided that nest. We suspect that possibly it would be a bald eagle, but we're not 100% sure of that. But with persistence, the pair did return in 2019, and they actually fledged 3 young that year. So it's been a really rocky road for this particular nest site, but over the past 7 years, they have produced 8 offspring. So another great contribution to the return of ospreys. Here's the 3rd nest site, and I refer to this as Nest 3C because of the story that I just told you about the relocation and relocation and relocation of that first nest for the 3rd site. So Nest 3 appeared in 2015, as I mentioned earlier, was unsuccessful in producing offspring. In that next winter, the nest was moved. It looked like the birds were going to accept it. They did not. And once again, that led to another late start, and so they were unsuccessful in 2016. So it was in 2017 that this pair started actually producing young, and so they've been actually doing that since that time. So now, over the past 5 years, there's been a total of 7 offspring fledged out of that nest. So all in all 3 nests have done very, very well once they've gotten started. So Fermilab is arguably one of the best sites in the county for ospreys. Overall, and over the last several years, going back to 2009, we've actually had 43 offspring come off of the site. So that's really a great contribution to the return of this species. Much of the site is restricted access, as I mentioned earlier, which means that there is much less pressure on these birds during the breeding season. There's many ponds and moats that are on site, so they have some very localized hunting, which is very beneficial. And they can go even further afield and hit places like the Fox River to the west or the west branch of the DuPage to the east. So there's many, many foraging opportunities. There are also other large retention ponds and large ponds in some of our forest preserves. So there's probably other nesting sites within the county, and if you happen upon one of either osprey or bald eagle, the Natural Resources Department of the Forest Preserve of DuPage County would certainly be interested in hearing about those. So you can probably find contact information on their website, and you should give them a heads up if you do locate one of those nests, because both species are now nesting in DuPage County. So thanks for taking the time to view this video. Hopefully we've given you some bird food for thought, and I hope you'll join us again in the future as we explore all things bird related.